Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have a really nice crowd here on Zoom. We ask you to remain muted during the presentation. We have a nice crowd here in our Oak Room, so we welcome everyone. And I would like to introduce Ellen Efros, who is joining us by Zoom, who will introduce our program for today. We will be recording this session. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome Victor del Hierro, who is going to be talking about the history of the Mexican-US border through mapping. You know, you say to yourself, God, mapping, how boring can that be? Well, it's really not. Victor's going to discuss the history of the borderland areas between Juarez, Mexico, and El Paso, USA, through maps. He's going to discuss how map making in the area has impacted the narrative of the place. As all of you know from reading the paper, this is a very timely subject right now. And the mapping of the area adds to the cultural differentiation and also the cultural stimulation of these two areas. I also want to mention as an aside that Victor is working on something totally unrelated to this mapping project. He's working on a book project titled The DJ is Precedent, Hip Hop, Community Building and Technical Communication. And this book is going to merge a discussion of the technical communications and community-based modes of knowledge production through research on hip hop practitioners and their culture. So he's got a wide range of interests, to say the least. But the talk today will definitely focus on the map making and how it impacts this area. And with that introduction, I will turn the presentation over to Victor.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I'm gonna start by sharing my screen here. All right, hopefully you can all see my screen.
Yes, it looks good.
All right. Welcome everyone. And thank you for joining me. I'll be reading off a script, so if you, sounds like I'm reading it, I definitely am. And if anything freezes at any point, please, somebody feel free to jump in. I have my camera thing with the other people's images minimized so I can see the screen fully. So just go ahead and shout at any time to stop me if anything is going wrong, as we've all learned to deal with this Zoom thing for a while now. As Ellen mentioned, my name is Victor del Hierro. I'm an assistant professor of digital rhetoric and technical writing in the English department. I want to open definitely by thanking Ellen and Julie and the ILR for hosting this event, as well as Dr. Barbara Meno, who's in here, and the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere for inviting me to participate in this program. As you have seen on the screen right now, the name of my presentation is The History of the Mexico-US Border Through Mapping. And I look forward to sharing what I've been working on and some of my findings in this regard. So welcome and thank you for joining me. First and foremost, I wanted to start out with some shout outs to the Timucua and Seminole peoples whose homelands are where the University of Florida currently occupies. In my short time here in Gainesville, I moved here in August 2019. I have started the process of learning more and more about the indigenous history of the area and of research of the various place names that have been used throughout Florida, including our own county name, Alachua, who is named for some of the earliest known stewards of the land. In reading about the Alachua culture, I found myself seeing some parallels between the colonial historiography here and those from my home area, hometown area, which is the El Paso Juarez Borderlands area. And I realized I really shouldn't be surprised, right? The same colonial presence occurs there. But to that token, I'd also like to shout out the Jornada Magallón, Manso, Piro, Tiwa, Indi, Mescalero, and Isla del Sur communities whom all have histories and relationships with the land where my study is focused. I was also surprised to learn recently, and I am remiss if I don't sort of bring this up at every public talk that I can, is that there are currently no tenure or tenure track Indigenous faculty at UF. And currently, based on what I was able to find and look up, there are 2 part-time Indigenous faculty at UF. Given the rich history that Florida has with Indigenous history, this is absolutely not the case. And so I'm hoping to bring some awareness to this, and hopefully in the next couple of years, we bring some Indigenous faculty to UF. And then one last quick shout out to Dr. Eda Zospinar and Dr. Laura Gonzalez, who are my co-PIs on this larger project, who've helped me do some of the larger research work, and we're all collaboratively working on a book, which is why I'm able to have such expansive research interests. And they gracefully brought me onto the project and give me the space to work on this, which I'm really excited about. And so given this is a lengthy presentation, I wanted to give you a quick overview of my talk. After this slide, I'll tell you a quick story about myself and how I relate to this project, given that my upbringing inspired the initial research questions and continue to influence my thinking on the project. And then I'll go into provide some context for how this project was designed and the overall overview of the larger project that we're working on. And then I wanted to do some brief introducing of my discipline, rhetoric and writing, which is significantly different from traditional English studies scholars. And then in the back half of the presentation, we'll look at some maps, and I'll give you some analysis, followed by the second part of the study, which includes involving members of the community. So I'll give you a rundown of how we conducted our research and our focus groups. And then we'll finish up with some videos from the interviews and concluding thoughts based on the interviews. And so, as I mentioned, this project has been brewing for the better part of the last 20 years because it's directly tied to my upbringing. But more importantly, the stories that are hardly ever told. I want to frame this presentation by showing you a picture of me when I was around 5 years old. This picture was taken in a park somewhere on the east side of El Paso, Texas. Aside from looking adorable and hoping to win you over with some old family photos, I want to point out to you that my Little League soccer uniform was actually a custom replica of the Ciudad-Juarez Cobras professional soccer team. That team no longer exists, but at the time had recently battled its way into the top professional league in Mexico and was earning national attention. I'm sure we were the envy of the other teams, as these were custom made by my dad for the whole team, and everyone else just had regular generic soccer store-bought uniforms. I love this picture because it gives a glimpse of what life on the border is actually like. It gives a visual representation of how 2 cities on the border live as a single binational culture. Quite frankly, it won't ever live as one on maps or on paper, but it does on the people and the culture they create. I have always been fascinated with maps and geography. I believe my 2nd grade Geography B first place finish is all the ethos I need when it comes to geography. If I knew where my certificate was, you better believe you would be looking at it on this slide. But instead, I'm using a map so you can see exactly where on the Mexico-US border I'm talking about. So we're looking at this region that is identified here as the El Paso region. My interest in space and place has always been a constant tension in my research. Especially as I think about the impact that colonial approaches to land have had on who I am. Bringing this understanding about maps and geography into conversation with a lot of the discussion that has been happening recently about the southern border helps to remind us that these conversations are not new, and that talking points and maps tell such a limited part of the story. Some things to take into account when we think about the southern border. It stretches about 2,000 miles, as you can see on this map, from the Pacific Ocean across the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, and then it reaches El Paso, Texas, where the Rio Grande becomes the line of demarcation that makes its way into South Texas, cutting through more desert, the Rocky Mountains, and finally emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. There is no larger urban area than the combined borderplex areas of Ciudad-Juarez and El Paso along the southern border. So El Paso is the biggest city you'll find on the US side, and Juarez is the biggest city you'll find on the Mexican side. Combined, they're a massive sort of what we call the borderplex area between the two. So it's a large urban space. So as I've listened to politicians turn the border into their campaign platforms, I have paid special attention to the language that they have used to discuss the border. Recently, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem was in the news for sending 125 troops of the South Dakota National Guard to Texas to help with what she described as, quote unquote, a crisis at the border. And more recently, patting herself on the back while addressing the crowd at the CPAC conference, she described the region as a, quote unquote, war zone. Governor Noem is not the first person to use this type of language to describe the region, but I'm always intrigued when governors and politicians with no connection to the region decide to use it as part of their platform. There's a border much closer to South Dakota. There doesn't seem to be much interest in discussing it, although I am curious to see what 125 troops will do to protect 2,000 miles of border. Luckily, a private donor was funding those troops and not taking state funding away from South Dakota, as they are currently still seeing high COVID death rates despite having one of the smaller and more rural populations in the country. So given all this talk about war zones, I find it appropriate to share my own account of the region as a representative of the most populated and robust cities along the border. Growing up in El Paso, Texas, consistently traveling back and forth by either walking or driving across the Mexico-US border to see family in Juarez, I never quite grasped how unique my childhood was. By the time I was 18, I'm sure I had quote unquote traveled internationally at least 1,000 times. Over and over, I had recited that I was a US citizen to customs officers, sometimes repeating it as the government official asked, again to ensure I could say it again in the same way. Declaring what groceries we bought to ensure we weren't bringing in contraband. What a word to learn in elementary school, contraband. Usually it was just pork products. It later dawned on me how impactful these weekend rituals were on my identity and the community at large around me. It was also something completely disconnected from the rest of my life. Living north of I-10 in El Paso meant a significant amount of rhetorical distance to ensure we never discussed this at school, something I assume was not so easy for the schools who were merely blocks away from the port of entry, from the different ports of entry. Reading scholars like Gloria Anzaldúa helped make sense of the experience, as well as Aristeo Brito's novel, The Devil in Texas. By the way, if you can find a copy of The Devil in Texas, it is absolutely one of my favorite fiction books about the period when Mexicans living in Texas had to adjust to their new reality of living in a new country while never moving. And to me, highlighted the resilience of the women I grew up around who, like in the novel, always pressed on, while the men drifted towards helplessness and depression. I encountered these texts in college, and while discussing them with classmates, what has always been interesting to me is, despite the source material, there were always abstractions about what the border was. In other words, people really liked the theories that Gloria Anzaldúa made about her experience being from the border, but were always quick to apply them to non-border contexts, while at the same time making assumptions about the people living on the border and never actually visiting what these spaces look like. It was in these moments and during these conversations I started to realize that conversations about borders or borderlands were not in line with what I experienced. Yet it seemed like folks were always quick and overwhelmingly willing to overdetermine and describe what they understood the border to be. Right now, people believe it to be a lawless place where tidal waves of asylum seekers are overwhelming the ports of entry. I'm not sure what a war zone would actually look like, but I do remember the feeling when I started to receive texts from friends asking if I was okay or if my family was fine, only to turn on the news and learn of an American man traveling 8 hours from Dallas, Texas to a Walmart, which shares a parking lot with Chula Vista Mall, which sees 10 million shoppers a year, to kill 23 people because he was looking for some Mexicans to kill. I mentioned the mall and its capacity to help paint a picture of how busy and important to binational and regional commerce this mall and city is that really only felt like a war zone when a domestic terrorist decided to make it one. And so this project is born not from the context of domestic terrorism, but from trying to talk about, describe, and represent the border from the perspective of those who inhabit that space. Specifically trying to understand the difference between how this space is understood by those who live there in comparison to how those spaces have been mapped for seemingly geopolitical purposes. Bringing together stories of lived experiences with a discussion of mapping becomes important because borders really only exist on maps and in international treaties. So how these regions have been historically mapped give us an understanding on how the border has been established and emphasized despite ongoing narratives that say the border is non-existent or barely holding on. Historically, but especially in our current political moment, the US-Mexico border is at best used as a part of political theater and propaganda, and at worst to base policy decisions that hurt the most vulnerable. Recent calls for a border wall and increased militarization at the ports of entry increase the xenophobia around the perception in border spaces, as well as disrupts everyday life for those who live on the border. These tactics are nothing new. Under George W. Bush, and especially after September 11th, the border with Mexico was militarized and a border fence was installed over portions of the US-Mexico border. As a result, our weekend rituals were reduced to monthly ones to avoid waiting in 3 to 4 hour lines on the bridge and increase scrutiny of our citizenship. Under the previous administration, militarization of the border was increased to continue to dehumanize those who cross the border, whether regularly for work, school, and to visit families, or for those exercising their human and lawful rights to asylum. I'm not sure how well the images are able to show these barbed wire contraptions here on the right, but these were used to block car lanes on the bridges for the ports of entry so that only 2 lanes could be used. And let me remind you that this mall that I talked about earlier still sees 10 million people a year, and this doesn't account for the 18-wheelers that travel daily delivering goods going in both directions. Wait times to cross the bridge were artificially inflated by reducing the number of available lanes for cars to pass and by increased protocols by custom agents as they verify your legal status. In addition of blocking car lanes, these mobile concrete fences covered in barbed wire were also used to prevent the tidal waves of asylum seekers from overwhelming the bridge, insinuating that at any moment a swarm of people will rush into the USA, overwhelming customs and border patrol agents. In addition, there were also random times of day the ports of entry were closed to perform military exercises on the bridge, as the image on the screen demonstrates. I say all this to draw attention to the ways that all these heavily political gestures aim to create a narrative around the border as some lawless space. A tidal wave of asylum seekers would never be able to overwhelm the border, but creating the concrete barbed wire fences ensures that the visual would reinforce the possibility. I guess if you're performing military exercise with border patrol agents, then maybe you really are living in a war zone. Never mind that Fort Bliss is located in El Paso with actual soldiers, where within the base, you are more likely to end up a victim of gun violence than anywhere else in the city. All these campaign stunts and political gestures did in the end was disrupt the connection between the two cities. The thousands of people who crossed daily had to add at least 2 hours to their commute or suspend them altogether as they made the decision about their day labor jobs, getting to class at schools in the K-12 public system, private Catholic schools, community college, and at the local university, or whether it was worth it to make the trip to visit family, which during COVID became more about ensuring family members were alive or sharing supplies. What gets left out of the narrative of the border is that a majority of these trips going in both directions at some point end with somebody returning home for the day. The point to emphasize here is that most of the movement across the border is no different than anyone else's daily commute. However, because these commutes involve 2 settler colonial nation states, this commute is quite unique and consistently outside of the narrative of this place. I do want to pause on this slide and read from the reporting around Texas Governor Abbott and his recent campaign around the border crisis. The narrative and story about the border is consistently perpetuated as we see the governor describe a part of his own state as a quote unquote third world country, where farmers and ranch owners, is subtle nod to overdetermine the border as this vastly rural space, are being overwhelmed with a tidal wave. So if this tidal wave is hitting ranchers and farmers, then why do we need concrete barbed wire mobile fences at the urban ports of entry? We do see that at least 131 miles of new border wall was built in the El Paso and Hudspeth County areas. So this might demonstrate why the tidal waves are being pushed out towards the more rural areas. I do want to send a gentle reminder that former President Trump in his 2020 campaign still owe the city of El Paso $560,000 for services rendered, including the use of police and fire department personnel, for his campaign rally on February 11, 2019. Furthermore, circling back to the comment about parts of the border looking like the third world, during the February winter freeze in Texas, at least 200 people have been confirmed to have died because of the lack of energy and heat due to the Texas electrical grid failing, and recent reporting and analysis puts the number of deaths within a range of 500 to 1,000. Something the city of El Paso did not deal with because they are the only major city in Texas not on the Texas electrical grid. So while Governor Abbott is soliciting donations from Texans to keep building the border wall, no funding or legislation has been introduced to fix the vastly underfunded and underdeveloped electrical grid. Interesting, the stories that get told about the region. And so to shift a little bit and tell you a little bit about the larger project, our research team was interested in studying the rhetorical cartography of the Juarez El Paso borderland to understand how it reflected in the narratives from inside and outside of the area, both in the past until today. Knowing that the history of the region draws back to Spanish colonization, we were interested in what maps were available and how the maps constructed this space. We also knew that as two settler nation states emerged, Mexico and the US, how would this impact the construction of this space? Furthermore, returning to our premise of amplifying the voices of people who live in these spaces, by looking at historical and contemporary maps, we wanted to document how the people from the borderlands reacted to and made sense of the maps and overall cartography of the region. So it is with this context and background that this project was born and continues to be influenced. As the questions on the screen reflect, what is the narrative surrounding the Mexico-US border? How is that narrative constructed? Who impacts that narrative? What can the history of mapping tell us about that narrative? And how might mapping help us better understand how we construct space? This project is all about the stories and narratives created about the border and how we might be able to shift that narrative when we start telling the stories with the border. Because of that, this project draws heavily from the influence of studying the relationship that rhetoric as a tool for writing and understanding stories has on the border. Furthermore, the important thing to remember about this project is that everything is rhetorical, including the maps. Excuse me. By that, I mean that mapping and cartography is not a neutral act of surveying. It is very purposeful and it is a very purposeful attempt at understanding space. This project is partly born from drawing on indigenous models of understanding land to unpack the current colonial geographies we are grappling with. We're making an initial hypothesis that part of the rhetorical and material violence we see at the border today is a result of the colonial relationship to land. The main difference between indigenous mapping in the Americas and colonial European model is that from an indigenous perspective, mapping is not about creating a survey of land, but rather reflecting a relationship to land. In other words, you mapped your movement and relationship to a space that will then make it a place. By comparison, the colonial emphasis for mapping was about defining boundaries to organize and discipline land so that it could be claimed. The distinction is about mapping to claim ownership as opposed to mapping to make sense of a space. One of the more significant examples of this is the way that waterways are used as boundaries, specifically rivers, like the one that sits between Juarez and El Paso. Looking at the two maps on the screen, we can see how the river is emphasized in one map to show the delineation between both countries. The map on the left is from 1896 and was part of a series of surveys that were taken as the river shifted over time and a dispute was emerging over the territory named the Chamizal. The map next to it is a satellite image from 2015. Of course, we do have to take into account that both cities have grown tremendously over the last 100 years. However, these two maps next to each other say a lot about the narrative of these two places. Primarily, a satellite image reveals that it's relatively difficult to discern where exactly one city starts and the other ends, signifying that in reality, the land cannot actually be segmented to reveal two different places. The next thing I'd like to point out is that map-making tools like perspective, or the way certain features of maps are enlarged, is a rhetorical tool used in the map from 1896 to both emphasize the river as a boundary, but also to try to influence the perceived size of each city when next to each other. Historically and contemporarily, since the separation of the city by the international border, Ciudad-Juarez has always been a larger and more important city than El Paso. Yet, according to this map, Ciudad-Juarez seems to be much smaller than El Paso. This is an ongoing theme in map making about the region. Ciudad-Juarez, or Mexico at large, is always drawn to be empty to emphasize the separation between the countries. This again is not the truth when we look at the satellite image that we can safely accept as the most accurate rendering of the land. One final comparison between these two maps is the perception of the river. In the satellite image, it is quite difficult to spot the river. This is because over time, especially since the river was channeled into a concrete border barrier, and with recent increase in droughts, the river barely carries any water year round, especially the part of the river that goes through the more urban concrete parts of the border area. I want to briefly situate how and where my analysis is developed, and I want to spend a slide talking about some maps. I wanted to spend that last slide talking about the maps to introduce the theoretical grounding that I'm drawing from. As you can see on the screen, I have three main methodologies that are grounding my project. The two main ones related to my discipline are cultural rhetorics and writing studies. Basically what this means, as is summed up in the paragraph on the screen, and as I previously stated, I work under the assumption that all acts of writing have the potential to make meaning. Furthermore, that meaning making is grounded in the values and ideologies that are informing the writer and the writing. Any genre of writing is coded with ideologies and therefore inform meaning being made. Map making is a genre of writing that, depending on the map maker, can be coded with a variety of influences, and primarily we see maps seeking to discipline space. This is why satellite images create interesting problems for map makers. I also reference here on my slide that I am a humanities-based scholar. Essentially, I'm interested in engaging directly with the people who are directly influenced or are stakeholders in the spaces and places I am working in. I'm not interested in doing this work without in some way making some significant effort to include community members and to try to positively influence their circumstances as a result of my research. That can come in the form of simple representation or lead to some kind of political influence. It would be great if the money spent on border walls or campaigns could go directly into the communities and positively impact their daily lives instead of the great disruptions that have occurred as the border and ports of entry have become weaponized for political theater. Next, I want to mention two highly influential thinkers and their projects on my work, just in case you wanted to read more. The first on the left is from Indigenous scholar Nachi Blue Barnd, his book, Native Space. This is an excellent resource for understanding how geographical practices have led to the establishment of a settler colonial nation and the way Indigenous people have been erased by strategically using place names to simultaneously acknowledge their existence, but always render it as something of the past. The more you normalize a name without the people, the less you remember the people. For example, before I mentioned it earlier, did it ever occur to you that Alachua was an indigenous word? Did you ever think that there were people living here before the Spanish colonized? Did you ever wonder where the indigenous people of the area ever went? Are they still here? The other text by Argentinian scholar Walter Mignolo, which is actually part of a trilogy that he has written to understand the colonial influence on thought and knowledge production in the Americas. His main thesis is in this text, The Darker Side of the Renaissance, is that while we recognize the Renaissance as an intellectual turning point for the West, we spent a long time ignoring that other parts of the world, the quote unquote darker side, were also making strides in creating intellectual traditions. This is in part where I draw my own arguments to separate rhetoric as solely a Greco-Roman concept away from the art of persuasion. Mignolo also discusses the importance of disciplining space and imposing Eurocentric geographical practices in the Americas to help colonize it. I highly recommend both of these texts if you're interested in reading more. And now that we've gotten all that out of the way, we can start looking at some historical maps. Interestingly, looking at some of the historical maps that we were able to access thanks to the generous funding of the Rothman Fellowship and the University of Texas El Paso and Austin libraries, the early Spanish maps of the area in question heavily relied on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo as the focal point of the map. In these early maps, we learn where El Paso got its name. Originally known as El Paso del Norte, or roughly translated as the pathway to the north, known as the connecting point between the heart of the Spanish colony in central Mexico or New Spain to the northern region known as New Mexico. What is significant about what this map is telling us is that, like contemporary times, El Paso del Norte was always a significant crossing point or border space. Regionally, it was always the connecting point between two places. However, notice that despite its status, its location on the map is near the bottom And what is centered here is the El Rio del Norte, currently known as El Rio Grande in the US and El Rio Bravo in Mexico. Furthermore, while it might be difficult to see on your screen, what is also significant is that the Spanish mapmakers made note of the indigenous communities that lived up and down the river. Rhetorically, what is interesting about this map is that it centers the river, making it the most important landmark, but it also understands the Paso del Norte region as far more expansive. It also seems to be a warning that the river acts as an inverse border, meaning staying close to it on your way north will keep you away from the indigenous communities that live on either side of the river. Looking at this map and understanding that over time, the area contained in the red box will go on to be the focus of the border region, the river will still be important. However, this historical map helps us realize how much of a mistake it might be to not consider the full length of the river as significant to the region. In this way, the river as a waterway is less significant than the river as a border boundary, meaning regardless of the water, its main purpose now is to divide instead of connect. I do want to note that the length of this space is quite large. And I'd like to compare the historical map to a contemporary Google map with the landmarks connected by arrows and lines for reference. Historical maps like these help us see the narrative that has developed over time through mapping. This early attempt to make sense of the area of land seems to draw on both the relationship between those moving in this space as well as surveying to make boundaries in the area. And so this historical map, I just found it really interesting when I first started looking at it. We actually get to see some of the mountains depicted here, which we don't now see in more contemporary maps. But basically connected as far north as the kind of the top border of what modern day New Mexico, with that top point being Taos, and then going all the way to the Junta de los Rios, which is where the Conchos River and the Rio Grande meet in sort of the valley in South Texas around the Big Bend area, if you're familiar with Texas at all, and then kind of north central or north east Chihuahua. So a pretty long distance. I used to have it mapped out, but I think it's something about 300 to 400 miles. This map, titled Fray Juan Miguel Menchero from 1740, is difficult to see, but features the river as a central feature of the map as well. This map has a detailed listing of all the cathedrals established throughout the region, essentially creating a network of colonial outposts for Spanish travelers. So if you look on the top right, that's the listing of all the cathedrals in the region. One of the interesting emerging themes here is that indigenous communities start to further get rendered to the margins or to less significant parts of the map. In this map, the further you are from the river, the less valuable or significant the land becomes. Empty space starts to fill it, right? We start to see more use of empty space in this manner. In the upper left side of the map, between two rivers, is listed the province of the Navajo. As I looked at these maps, especially as we consider how present indigenous communities have always been in the maps despite their erasure, I can't help but wonder what these maps would look like from an indigenous perspective. What would they choose to center? What landmarks would they highlight? What parts of the land would they focus on? These questions led to the second half of this project. While this doesn't account for an indigenous perspective of the border region, we did want to shift our understanding of map making to a more localized approach. What would local community members say about their home was represented in maps, and what would they hope to center? How do they interact and build a relationship to the land? And how did that influence their understanding of map making, of making sense of the land? To finish up the presentation, I want to discuss two different approaches to participatory mapping. The first with a group of youth asking them to map their neighborhood, which was adjacent to the Bridge of the Americas. And the second was a focus group asking research participants to interpret and make sense of historical and contemporary maps. On the screen, you are seeing a smart board with Post-it notes. I am seeing an accurate representation of the Juarez El Paso borderlands. Excuse me. This map was made by participants of La Escuelita, an after-school program for youth and their mothers that took place in South Central El Paso in the Chamizal neighborhood area. What is significant about this map is the orientation. In our typical Cartesian understanding of space, the top of a map should be the geographical north. However, for these youth, given their orientation to space. The top of their map are landmarks specifically in Juarez. The center of the map is the community center that we met for our after-school sessions located in their housing community. Also at the center of the map is a posted note that says "the people," which I believe represents an important awareness of how they are understanding their job as cartographers. Right, here it's a gesture to sort of make sense of space from your perspective, not necessarily trying to fully account for the whole space. This map exemplifies what it's like to live in the Borderlands space. For the youth involved in making this map, complicated narratives about their relationship to both nation states emerge in the creation of the map. For some youth, Juarez is a place they never visit because of citizenship statuses of the adults around them. Thus, this continually impacts how they understand the space, as well as impacts their daily life because of the two nations that rub against each other. For other youth, Juarez is home or a place they return to on the weekends because one parent is allowed to cross and the other is not. So spending weekends in the place they can live with both parents is where home is. As part of this project, we have also conducted focus groups with university students who cross daily to attend class and work, as well as students who have significant history of border crossing. We asked them to analyze historical maps like the ones I showed you and contemporary maps made by government agencies. We then asked them to construct maps based on their experience of the region. By creating these maps, we are hoping to bring a consciousness to how this borderland space is made in practice, as opposed to what satellite images can tell us about a region. While building this map with youth, as a research group, we began to think more about what this project could look like. As we integrated historical maps into our project, we wanted to continue including the voices of our community members because of the insight we saw from our after-school students. As the question on the screen suggests, what does the narrative about the border look like when we ask members of the border community to answer this question? Do we hear about tidal waves of immigrants or war zones? Or do we get something different, based in longstanding history and relationships of living in a place? Thus, we shifted to conducting our focus groups with these major points in mind. In our focus group, we wanted to include community members in the analysis of the historical maps, as well as wondering if our hypothesis about the role that colonial historical maps played in influencing the perception of the border. And so I'll give y'all a second to read this slide as I'll kind of repeat some of the things that are on here on the next slide. And so while I was a faculty at the University of Texas El Paso, I invited some students to sit down for some initial focus groups. Many of these students crossed the border daily at one point in their lives, and some continue to do so as they attended the university. On the screen is the protocol we followed for our focus groups. And so I want to briefly go through it. And I wanted to show you all the protocol, because I'm going to show some videos in a bit of these interviews and listening to students. But I want you to kind of get a sense of how we constructed the focus group, so you can see sort of how we laid it out and trying to sort of solicit their answers and get as broad a sort of understanding as we could as we made our way through the maps and looking at things. And so we first sat down, got our consent forms ready. We gave them an overview of the project, why we were interested in the project, why we were thinking about the border, and what we were trying to accomplish. And then we had each participant introduce themselves and their relationship to the border, and then asked them to define the border, which is what we'll see in that first video. And then after that, we kind of gave the instructions that we were going to show them a set of maps. We had 3 different categories. That we had historical maps, some military maps we found, and then what we identified as boundary maps. And we'd look at 2 of each, about 5 to 8 minutes. And as they were looking at them, we wanted to ask them sort of how they were navigating the map, right? What they were familiar with, what they were unfamiliar with, whether these maps made sense based on their experience of the region. And then to kind of give feedback, right? And focus groups coming from the technical communication side of it was always sort of about giving feedback and better sort of understanding or better designing, right? So how would you sort of change this map? What would you add to it? What is needed to help make better sense of it? And so asking these kinds of questions, as well as sort of as you're looking through the maps, like what landmarks are consistently there that you can recognize that help you orient yourself. And then we would have them look at a folder of maps that seem interesting to them, what stuck out. And then they would look at a few more. And then finally, in the last sort of section of it, which I don't have video of, or I didn't have time to fit it into this presentation, was for them to draw their own maps, and which was really interesting, but I think gets summed up in the last video that you'll see. And then it's gonna get a little clunky here for a second as I'm gonna open up this link so you can see how we showed them the maps. And so we used a tool called Esri. And we would basically just go through each map. So here's one that's similar to one you saw earlier, right? And we continue to see this theme of the river being centered, as well as these boundaries now being drawn in. And then here on the outside edges, we can see indigenous names for the different tribes that, again, are kind of pushed away from the border. This was an interesting map to show as we asked students to try to identify where El Paso was, and they had some trouble, but it is down here in this bottom corner. And if you know, it was always hard to read them, so it always was about sort of identifying spaces on land. The next map was this one. That was a boundary map of the United States from 1853. Again, there was a wide range of disputes as the river moved to different places. One of the earlier maps I showed you, if you were able to sort of look at it closely, the river literally went from the middle, from above downtown El Paso to right through the middle to underneath it, where it kind of sits today. And then we found this interesting military map. So there's an Air Force base in the region as well, Biggs Army Air Force base. And this is a map that they had that I think is really interesting to look at, which is a kind of laying out sort of how planes can fly through and the different ways that things that they would need to navigate. And then we have this map, which again is related to the sort of reconstruction of the river and sort of laying it out in different, as they were attempting to move it and contain it. And then finally, some boundary maps. This is a map of colonias. Colonias are basically small kind of immigrant-made housing communities outside of, in sort of outside of the larger cities. So there was one actually close to where I lived that a bunch of my friends lived in called the Sparks Colonia. They all attended my high school. They kind of lived outside of a little bit out, just within the city limits, but outside of sort of regular neighborhoods, and they kind of constructed their own neighborhoods through there. And these are all the different colonias that exist across the border. And then a similar boundary map as I talked about and we saw earlier. This is where the river, you can see my mouse cursor going through. This is where the river initially was at one point. And it also used to be right around here. And so those were the maps we showed them. So I'll switch back to my slides. I'm gonna jump out and jump back in just to avoid any issues. And so that was the protocol for the focus groups. We went through and they, answered the questions, and hopefully were able to see what they could see, right? And there was no really right or wrong answer, just because we're genuinely curious. You live in a space that's been mapped in these different kinds of ways over time. What do you see? Do they represent what you see? What do they look like? And so I want to now transition to the videos of the focus groups, and as they discuss the various maps and the questions we pose to them, I'm eager to share these videos because in their own words, the research participants are able to articulate best what the borderlands are and the ways that they exist outside of political theater. So here's our first video when we asked them to define the border.
I think the border is just like a arbitrary political thing. Like, it doesn't feel like it's two different cities. It just feels like one is the extension of the other. You just change language or use a mix of both. But I don't think there's like it's just like an arbitrary thing. It seems like it's more of like a symbol than anything, just like a political symbol.
because I've lived almost my whole life in El Paso, it's hard to define the border. It's become almost kind of invisible to me, unless I'm made conscious that there's a border between the two cities. So now that I'm thinking about it, it's hard to define it. I guess it's just a space where I've witnessed a lot of exchange of like culture and people and time and space. It's like an intersectional space.
So I am from the border. I was born in El Paso, raised in Juarez. Similar to Estefania, I cross the bridge almost every day. I was a border commuter throughout my undergraduate degree and my master's degree. So when the violence was very, very bad, those were the hard days. Like right now it's nothing compared to 2006, 2007. I'm from both cities. I'm from Juarez and I'm from El Paso. To me, the border represents home, represents my childhood, my family, my friends, everything. I'm from here. However, to me, I've always been conscious aware of how different the two countries are. So you have Juarez and you have El Paso, and you feel the difference as soon as you cross the bridge. So to me, it's two very, very different cities coming together. So to me, I don't see the bridge as something negative. I see it as something positive, and it's something that unites both countries. So that's to me like the border means union, and it means home.
So again, this first video I think is really interesting to consider the different things that each of the participant is saying, the different kinds of relationships that they've built towards. There are like at times contradictory sentiments, but for each of the participants sort of made sense in the context of it, right? And there is a short allusion there to the violence that was occurring in 2006, 2007 in Juarez, at the height of a very like significantly scary drug war that I very much remember, that we have not seen, and sort of when we want to talk about an actual war zone, there are examples of things that we can point to that is not at all representative of what we're currently seeing or what we've ever seen when it comes to migratory statuses or folks crossing back and forth, right? It was something that was relatively well contained within the Juarez side, and hardly, never really spilled into the El Paso side. So it was never sort of an issue like that where tidal waves were ever going to be coming over in this direction. Oh, sorry, this is always clunky with trying to get to the different videos. And so in this next video, we'll see some responses to the historical maps, which again is sort of really interesting. We have our same lineup of participants.
Well, what grabs my attention is kind of like the green line in the middle. I guess that's a river, is it? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't really understand.
Yeah, I'm like, what is that line?
I think this map is hard to read. That's what I was looking at. Everything looks the same.
Right.
Oh yeah, it is a border. Right, doesn't it say Rio de something at the top?
I mean, so the word Mexico you can read like immediately.
And then it says Rio, but I don't know which river it is.
Yeah. That what you're looking at? Yes, that one, that line, the big green one.
Rio and then I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you scroll down a bit? Del Norte.
Yeah. And then you have all these mountains. So it kind of looks like it's all one place, like one city, with different things. Like I don't see any differences, to be honest. Like, or I don't know if this is a map of Juarez. I don't know what I'm looking at. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it has terms that I don't recognize as now being used now, maybe.
Well, I know it's this region because of the mountains and lack of nature.
There's little trees.
I mean, we have like 3 trees, but that's fine. But yeah.
Yeah, because it says Apaches, so that's also something else that makes me know it's this area. But
yeah,
that's about it.
Yeah, it says a lot of different Apaches.
I think this has more terms that I can like situate myself with. has the Franklins, and it uses Rio Bravo, which is something that I usually like hear more about the river.
Where do you see that? Oh, yeah.
Rio Bravo
Okay,
and Franklin's
I'm
over
sorry.
there on the mountains.
Okay. And then you kind of see like the, I don't know, like on the top left corner, you have like the city. Is that like the city? And then you say Paso del Norte. Mm-hmm. So like, yeah, I mean, yeah, all of those like little squares that are kind of like the city, I guess.
Is Paso del Norte in Chihuahua though? Is it like Juarez?
I think it's this whole area used to be called Paso del Norte.
And so in this video, I think what's really interesting is the ways that they're sort of navigating the maps and doing so through sort of landmarks or identifying things that they're already familiar with, that they would that you would know from being in the region, right? Understanding that Paso del Norte was a historical name, the mountain ranges and what they're named, knowing a little bit about the indigenous communities in the area, recognizing Apache on the map. And so it's sort of, I'm not sure that any of us have actually done something like this from our own hometowns or our own home communities or where we live now, where we look at historical maps and try to identify like, where is this, where is that? Maybe it's something we used to do a lot more, and I know something I've always done with my interest in mapping, but it's sort of interesting to sort of see your sort of home reflected back to you and drawing on whatever you had to sort of understand and make sense of what you are seeing. And here's the next video, which is another really interesting video where folks will talk about their relationship to the river.
But it's super weird because, well, I don't know if you have similar experiences, but to me, like, growing up, I was never aware of, like, I knew we had a river, but because it was always without water, dry, it didn't click to me that, oh, you know what, we actually have a river. Mm-hmm. So seeing the river in the map, it's like, oh yeah, we have a river, but you're never aware of the river if you're from the border. So that is something, I don't know, like.
I think you're right, like I would never see it with like water or anything, but I think I was aware just because people always said phrases that pertain to the river, you know, like, oh, cruzaste el charco.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bit, but yeah, you're right. It's not like because it had water. It's more because of how it's mentioned.
Yeah.
Cruzaste el charco would be a phrase about like you crossed over, so the river kind of represented
that's
the border.
The
and that's what mojados, like because you're wet, like you cross, like walking the river.
The dry river. Like, oh, we have a beautiful river.
No, it's like, it would always be like, But also, I don't know, like to me, like growing up also, they were like, you never go inside the river because you're going to die because it's very dangerous. So I would always be scared if I would see the river with water. Like I'm like, oh, you have to stay away from that. Up to this date, I don't know if that's true, but I'm like, I never go inside the river. Yeah.
I think there was a different relationship with the river before because my parents have told me that people used to cross it a lot more easily, like to come visit El Paso or. I think my dad told me he once came across it to come to like a concert in El Paso or something like that. Then maybe like the fear that we have more of it now, like that people die trying to cross it.
So you think someone from your parents' generation would have a different understanding?
Yes.
Yeah. The other day I was driving with my mom on the border highway, and then she, like, I don't remember like where we were, was passing the X, and then she said, oh, my friends used to cross like from Juarez to El Paso, and we would pick them up here and then we would go out. And I was like, oh, they crossed illegally? And she said, yeah, they would just jump over the fence and then just walk across the river. So I remember she said that.
I think depending on the maybe generation or time, people do have different relationships to the river.
And like now you go and there's like all the fences and you can't even like get really close to it and then all the border patrols and then someone who got shot recently across the border in the river. So I don't think anyone would necessarily go near it now.
And so this is a uniquely sort of experience in talking about folks who are in the El Paso Juarez region, just because of how the river has lost its sort of significance as a body of water, as I previously mentioned, and the different kinds of stories that people used to tell, but now is the droughts and the lack of water continues to shift the understanding and narrative of it, which maybe possibly the lack of water is why we need more fencing. But I know downstream and upstream, it's no longer the border. There are more significant sort of parts of the river with water in it. So this is definitely a unique story to the El Paso region. And then here we'll sort of discuss with a different set of focus group participants their understanding of border violence as they discuss some of the maps and where the conversation came from.
Conveys this like idea of like cutting to control, like to creating small boxes to kind of locate resources and think like, I don't know, like, yeah, things from one place to another. It's more like operative in some sense.
So as you're saying that, it's reminding me of how politicians today would want to see the borderland, right? As in control, as in secured, restricted, and all that.
And I'm gonna actually zoom through the next couple of videos as we're running up close to an hour here.
So this is easier to situate somehow. I don't know if then it means that the way we see geography is through a militarized lens, which is sort of scary. So, so you see the line that divides the territories very clearly. You see El Paso, Ciudad-Juarez, El Paso, Ciudad-Juarez, and then you see the Texas.
It doesn't speak to me. It's just lines.
Okay, why? So because it's just lines? That's okay.
Yeah, that's it. I think I'd rather have the other one with the weird, borderland, right? The other one was telling me, this is the borderland, this is nice, this is the borderland. This one is just like, this is it, right?
Yeah.
That was just lines. I mean, we're just lines in a map.
This is more accurate. I mean, I can make out Juarez more like the way it is.
Is it satellite?
Mm-hmm. It's
Yeah.
aerial photography.
Makes more sense.
So it looks, you see now bigger concentration of people, you know, which is what you feel once you cross to Juarez, you know, you see more people. Even though, you know, that street of El Paso Street is like filled with people. With Juarez is even more once you cross.
And then this will be our final video that I thought really gave us some good parting thoughts.
So what to me is missing in all of these maps is a map that makes sense with both cities together, like to navigate. One map that I can clearly recognize accurately Juarez and El Paso as one single city, because that's the way I see it, and that's you know, one of the things that most surprised me about this Juarez, both Juarez and El Paso, in the comparison to other cities in Mexico, for example, is how downtown, you know, what we would call the center of the city, is not at the center of the cities. In Juarez is on the north, and you know, Paso is in the south. So to me, the explanation is that this is the center of both cities.
Yes, of the whole.
And I was, I don't know, hoping that historically that would be the case at some point, like in some point in history, both cities be the same, you know, and that's
the kind of map that you.
yeah, because I've seen, and there's this project, and I don't know if this is a sort of mock project, but some architects, I think in the United States, created a project for both cities as a bicultural city. So roads that connects Juarez and El Paso, and you know, I just thought historically that's what was both fields, the Paso and Juarez before. And you know, since I'm just commuting, so it would make more sense to see both as a unit in a way.
And so, considering our research participant Moy and his parting thoughts about the two cities joined by their respective downtowns, I wanted to highlight this area in the satellite image, which they were looking at and describing. Early in the presentation, I compared this map with the one from 1896, and I thought it was interesting that the area the 1896 map was representing comes up again, and this time is represented in the satellite image. And while still a significant connecting point, in my experience, it's been interesting to see how the other two ports of entry have also become hubs for connecting the two cities, right? And Moy mentioned briefly, and the other focus group as well talked about the bridges as connecting points. The Bridge of the Americas, also known as the Free Bridge, is not only the largest in the region, but actually sits in the geographical center of both cities. And not too far from this downtown bridge, but more centralized. This bridge connects near the Chamizal areas, which was also brought up earlier, and connects both of the city's major highways. You can get to the major highways in Mexico and Juarez side, and as well as connecting to I-10, which we all know I-10 comes from California to Florida. And not to mention that the Free Bridge, or the Bridge of the Americas, is relatively close and connects to the malls that I can't seem to stop talking about. Furthermore, as we discussed what it would look like to make our own maps, the prevailing thing that existed was that the cities had to be connected. Consider this map of cities with the highest Mexican populations, a rare map that I have seen that lists Juarez and El Paso together. Considering that this borderplex area lands here in 6th place, it is hard to ignore that these cities are linked by their population alone. I do think it's important to point out that Juarez accounts for 1.5 million of the 2.1 million combined population. Take into account that the Juarez-El Paso borderlands would also be the 5th largest city in the United States if somehow Juarez was absorbed into the US, nearly tripling the entire population of the state of South Dakota. And this, when I came across this map, I just really loved it, and I was really intrigued by it, and to see sort of Mexican populations not only sort of listed in the Mexico side of it, but as far north as Chicago, right, and the many southwestern cities, as well as cities all across Texas. I want to end my presentation with a map that has been circulating by the social media account Decolonial Atlas of the Caribbean and Florida, with the Taino names on the landmasses. When I first saw this map, it reminded me of the historical maps I had showed you, but what's significant to me is how much more it made sense to think of the region as a whole. Perhaps this is my own bias as someone new to the area, but to think of Florida as part of the Caribbean seems to make a lot more sense than perhaps Florida as part of the US South. I want to draw on the previous two maps to consider the implications of map making to resist the colonial urge of containing ourselves to geopolitical borders, and to instead consider what land would look like if we consider relationships instead of surveying or disciplining. Threats of hurricane cannot be the only times we think of this region as linked. I see the Taino names across the region and wonder what the alternate future would look like if we considered indigenous populations and the decisions we made about the land masses represented in this map. These are the type of interventions that I believe participatory and practice-based mapping can help us with reimagining our geographies and relationships to land. And so with that, thank you so much. And I really had great fun talking with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so we can jump into the Q&A, but thank you.
Okay, does anyone have any questions for Arthur? It seems such a shame to waste what is obviously your in-depth knowledge of these border issues, you know, just in terms of the mapping, when, you know, the politicians are screaming at each other as to where the borders lie and how they should be protected.
Yeah.
They could probably put it to better use, including your project.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think it's just I think more than anything kind of just disrupts people's lives so much when you're living on the border, and just, I mean, having to sit in a 3-hour line in the desert in the summer just makes no sense when you're in your car overheating or whatever. It just doesn't, it's just not smart.
Especially when it's a one-parent commute.
Exactly.
Does anybody have any questions for Victor?
I do have one here on Zoom. Holly, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful. And it reminds me, I've been trying to do, I'm a native Floridian, although I've been every place else, but I was trying to remember what year I was at Fort Bliss. I want to say 1974, I think, and how different it is, I'm sure today. I've not been back, but I've been trying to do more reading in the last, since COVID and so forth, about Indigenous peoples in the United States and their relationship, to connecting countries like Canada and Mexico. And I so appreciate your viewpoint, because clearly what we're missing, if you think of Homeland Security and some of the things going on with the government, you yourself, and I'm sure colleagues of yours, are such a rich resource to deal with these issues, like, the whole issue of splitting families and looking at everybody as a whole, instead of like what was very clear in your presentation, and I knew it from being in that area briefly, was this daily crossing, of that border and how people's on each side. I can remember going, I had to cover my eyes, but a couple of my surgeons and other medical colleagues would cross the border to go to a bullfight.
Yeah.
And my relationship to the Border Patrol was one of the surgeons going down to meet the matador because he wanted a set of horns, which we got back across the border under an army blanket, and they didn't search the car. So when you were talking about that, it reminded me. But my whole point being, you need to be a consultant to the Biden administration, seriously.
Yeah.
Because I think it would change so many things about how issues are viewed and how peoples are viewed. There's so many people who just don't get it, just like other Indigenous people. I'm so glad that Deb Haaland is head of Interior in our country now. I just think it's fabulous. I wrote her a letter to tell her so. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I'm glad you were able to enjoy the bullfights. We used to go pretty often when they were still running. Unfortunately, the major bullfight, or the major bull ring arena in Juarez was demolished in place of a Walmart. So after we lost that bull ring, we lost our bullfights. And actually my grandfather's brothers were bullfighters for a long time. So we attended often.
Oh, really?
Good, yeah. Yeah, it's, I think what also gets lost, and I think is like this is like one side of the history, but there's such a fascinating, like, even like just the stories around the time during Prohibition, with Juarez becoming a major hub for sort of just all kinds of random American celebrities coming through, and even that kind of stuff. Like those types of stories are also kind of being left out, despite, sort of maybe some of their infamy with the relation to it. But there are so many different kinds of pockets of history, especially in this specific place, that I think just gets left out when we really reduce it to these kinds of conversations that we've recently been having. And again, it's just kind of does not making the country safer, is not actually helping any of the issues that are currently occurring, but it is completely ruining, I think, people's lives. I still had some graduate students at UTEP, and I mean, they didn't cross the border throughout the whole time during COVID. We're not allowed to cross over. And so luckily they were able to fulfill their duties as grad students through Zoom, but just those simple kinds of things really just completely collapses and ruins folks' lives as they try to sort of navigate these types of things.
Well, it's like rules made with a misunderstanding of human beingness.
Yeah. And throughout the ongoing sort of refugee crisis that we've seen, and asylum seekers, I was, I moved here in 2019, so I was there during the heart of that. And there are, tons of organizations and nonprofits that are happily and willingly able to help immigrants cross over, to help them sort of be connected to their families, help them connect to families that are already here, help them process and document these types of things. But they were simply just not able to fulfill a lot of these demands and requests because folks were being held at the bridge, under the bridge, and just completely awful conditions, right? And I think what became a sort of manufactured crisis, I think was sort of the best way to sort of describe those things, because those things, there've always been histories of this. I had a slide up earlier with the bath riots where they used to spray down immigrants as they cross over in the 20s, and in this giant holding facility that got locked up and burned down and killed a bunch of people in it. So this has happened before, but these are constantly sort of manufactured situations that are only sort of put in place through policy and are not sort of in any other way kind of dealt with. And there are people that are wanting to help out and deal with these situations. And so I think when we only sort of, part of sort of only thinking about these things from this sort of deficit model, which we're sort of seeing a lot of things, and we see deficit models all along policy decisions, we're not going to make the best decisions. So I think trying to help folks understand the differences in what these places actually are and look like, and what border policy does and influences people on, I think would be a good first step in trying to resolve some of these issues.
Well, I know we all appreciate your presentation today. I see one more question here from our Oak Room, if you'll hold on tight.
This is a comment, not a question, to emphasize how the two cities are connected. The University of Texas El Paso accepts that Texas rates in-state tuition. Anyone who graduates from 4 years of a high school in Juarez, and the students used to come over every day for classes. And my daughter teaches at the university, and so she frequently went over doing research over in Mexico. And all of that has changed, and no one can cross over.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear there's some UTEP representation in the crowd. Yeah, I mean, it's been that's sort of the whole region, I think, is interesting in that way too, because I think we're 45 minutes from the New Mexico border as well. And I believe in-state tuition is offered to students at New Mexico State University, at UTEP, for students all across that sort of region. And we get, it definitely creates such an interesting teaching experience, such an interesting opportunity to do research and to work with students in that binational space. And I think the opportunity to really think about education across all different disciplines, from engineering to business to liberal arts to I think I already mentioned education, to social sciences. I mean, to do that in a binational sort of space, to really think about what these things look like, serving different kinds of people, students at the same time, I think is a really interesting and awesome opportunity. And so a lot of that gets disrupted. And I think I think a situation like COVID really disrupted everything, and I think didn't create new issues. I think just exacerbated the previous issues. And so I think, which we've seen all across the country and across the world. But yeah, I think folks working at UTEP, and I actually was a little bit disappointed in a lot of my colleagues who never actually took the time to head over into Juarez, because Juarez is twice the size of El Paso. So if you missed a more urban or metropolitan space, I mean, the restaurants and the life things you can do in Juarez were just, plays coming through, concerts, just the different sort of experience that you get from Juarez. I think a lot of folks miss out on if they don't sort of fully embrace it. Even just doing a little bit of the shopping in the downtown area is always good.
Well, we thank you for your time today. Barbara or Ellen, do you have any comments for what we can look forward to next week? Barbara, anything?
I think Ellen is speaking, but she wasn't unmuted.
Oh.
I mean,
All right.
next.
We appreciate your time, Victor. Everyone, stay well, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Arthur, thank you so much. I mean, Victor, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.